Rome, the mid-20th century. A city standing between the shadows of war and the promise of rebuilding. Life was hard, but families endured, and children still dreamed. But in one struggling neighborhood on the outskirts of the capital, a single disappearance would ignite fear, outrage, and one of the most heartbreaking criminal cases Italy had ever seen. She was only 12 years old, an ordinary girl with an ordinary errand. A short walk, a bag of groceries, and then she was gone. Her name would soon echo across Rome. A desperate mother, a fractured community, a police force under fire, and a story that still raises more questions than answers. This is the tragedy of the little girl whose death exposed the fears, the failures, and the fragile justice of an Italy still learning to heal. To understand how this story began, we must first step into her world, into the family and the neighborhood that shaped the final days of her life. This is the case of Annarella Bracci, a young girl whose short life began on December 15, 1937, in Rome. Annarella was born to Leonello Bracci and Marta Focchi, a couple who had married a few years earlier, but struggled almost from the start. Their relationship was marked by constant arguments, financial strain, and an instability that shaped the childhood of all 6 of their children. Marta came from a family with deep ties to religious institutions and, according to those who knew her, had been raised under strict discipline in the care of nuns. Her husband, Leonello, came from a simpler background. He worked long hours repairing Roman roads, hard, physical labor that barely kept the household afloat. Despite their very different upbringings, the two had fought to stay together, even as their circumstances pulled them further apart. In the early years of Annarella's life, the family lived in San Lorenzo, a crowded working-class neighborhood just east of central Rome. San Lorenzo was known for its tight-knit streets, its vibrant personality, and the resilience of its people. Life there was noisy, communal, and full of everyday struggle, a world where families leaned on each other to get by. It was in this environment, shaped by poverty but strengthened by community, that little Annarella took her first steps. No one could have imagined then that her name would one day become part of one of Italy's most heartbreaking and controversial criminal cases. Everything changed for families across Italy on June 10, 1940, when the nation entered World War II. Overnight, ordinary life in Rome was replaced by fear, uncertainty, and the constant threat of destruction. As the conflict escalated, the city became a strategic target, and by 1943, the Allied bombing raids were relentless. Their goal was to cripple Italy's military and industrial power, but the reality was far darker. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, civilians were killed, and the rhythm of daily life dissolved into chaos. With each new air raid, more families fled. Some escaped to the countryside, others to nearby towns, anywhere that offered even the slightest sense of safety. Many of Rome's poorest residents moved toward the outskirts of the city, into developing districts that had been built before the war as low-income housing. One of those districts was Primavalle, a working-class borgata in northwest Rome. Designed in the 1930s to ease overcrowding in the city center, Primavalle quickly transformed into a refuge for those trying to outrun the bombs. Its simple buildings and open spaces didn't offer luxury, but they provided something far more valuable at the time: distance from the heaviest air attacks. Annarella Bracci and her family were among those who relocated there. When the war finally ended in 1945, they remained in Primavalle, trying to rebuild their lives along with thousands of others. Although reconstruction projects slowly began improving the area, the poverty was still overwhelming. Jobs were scarce, homes were cramped, and basic necessities were often out of reach. For families like Annarella's, survival was a daily struggle. And it was in this landscape of hardship and resilience that her story continued to unfold. By 1949, the Bracci household was falling apart. After years of arguments and financial strain, Leonello Bracci finally walked away from the marriage. He took the 2 youngest boys with him, leaving the rest of the children behind. For 11-year-old Annarella, This meant stepping into responsibilities no child should ever carry. She became the one who kept the home running, because there was simply no one else who could. Her mother, Marta Foki, did not recover from the separation. Already fragile, she became anxious, unpredictable, and overwhelmed by the pressure of providing for her remaining children. With no steady income and no family support, she began going out at night, returning with men who would pay her just enough to buy food. Neighbors whispered about her behavior, and the gossip spread quickly through Primavalle's narrow streets. Some feared that Annarella might follow the same path. But the young girl refused to. She took on small tasks around the neighborhood, running errands, delivering items, doing whatever she could to earn a few coins. She spent as little time as possible inside the home, not only to avoid her mother's turmoil, but also to stay away from her oldest brother, Mariano. He had lost a leg in an accident and, consumed by anger and frustration, often lashed out violently. Life inside the cramped apartment grew more unstable by the day. The tension in the family escalated even further when Marta began seeing a local street cleaner named Adamo Moroni. He was a man known for his rough appearance, and his presence brought new conflict into the home. Rumors spread quickly, and eventually Rotero accused Marta of adultery, a serious charge in those years. The matter reached the courts, and young Annarella found herself summoned to testify. Her statement was honest and direct, but it deeply humiliated her mother. The consequences of that testimony lingered, adding another painful layer to an already fractured family, and setting the stage for the tragedy that would soon follow. Saturday, February 18, 1950, should have been a night of celebration. Carnival had arrived in Primavalle, and the neighborhood, normally quiet and struggling, was alive with music, costumes, and the rare feeling of joy. But for 12-year-old Annarella, the evening wasn't about festivities. At home, her younger siblings were hungry, and her mother handed her a few coins, asking her to buy pasta, a bit of oil, and some coal for the stove. Just after 7:30 p.m., Annarella stepped out into the dimly lit streets. The daylight was gone, and only scattered lamps lit the narrow alleys of the Borgata. As she walked, she ran into her friend Anna Cecchini, and the two talked briefly about the excitement unfolding around them, the laughing crowds, the music, the colorful masks. After a short chat, Annarella continued on her errand. A little farther along, she crossed paths with Leonello Aidi, a 25-year-old gardener who had once rented a room in the Bracci family's basement. Recognizing her, and noticing how hungry she looked, he bought her a small bag of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor. It was a simple gesture, one he had made before with children in the neighborhood. From there, Annarella moved quickly between the makeshift market stands. She purchased the coal, picked up the pasta, and then stopped at the home of Signora Berlincioni, hoping she might spare a bit of cooking oil. Times were hard for nearly everyone in Primavalle, but the woman offered what she could. Annarella thanked her politely, gathered her things, and turned back toward home. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Despite the short distance she had to walk, Annarella never made it back to her family's door, setting in motion one of Rome's most heartbreaking mysteries. Hours passed, and the excitement of Carnival faded from the streets of Primavalle. But inside the Bracci home, Marta Foki was sinking into panic. Her daughter still hadn't returned. She stepped outside, asking neighbors if they had seen little Annarella, but every answer was the same. No one had. For a woman already overwhelmed by life, the silence was unbearable. As the night grew colder, Marta's fear only intensified. She walked through the neighborhood calling her daughter's name, stopping at doorways, hoping someone might say Annarella had simply fallen asleep at a friend's house. But deep down, she felt something was terribly wrong. The girl would never wander far. Not at night, and not without telling her. Desperate, Marta eventually made her way to the local police station. The officers listened, but their reaction was indifferent. It was Carnival Saturday, a time when children often stayed out late, and Rome was dealing with protests and unrest that were stretching police resources thin. To them, it seemed likely that a 12-year-old had just joined the celebrations and lost track of time. But Marta knew her daughter, and she knew this wasn't that. She kept searching through the night, stopping anyone she passed, repeating the same question over and over. "Have you seen my little girl?" Still, no one had. By noon the next day, exhausted and trembling, Marta returned to the station. This time, her fear was unmistakable. The officer on duty finally realized that this wasn't a simple case of a child staying out too late. Something darker might be unfolding. He assured her he would take the matter to his commanding officer. For the first time since Annarella vanished, the police began to understand that this disappearance could not be ignored. Word of Annarella's disappearance spread quickly through Primavalle, and the tight-knit community wasted no time coming together. Neighbors searched alleys, courtyards, and open fields, calling her name long into the night. Among the volunteers was Leonello Aidi, the young gardener who had bought her chestnuts earlier that evening. He joined the search as if nothing unusual had happened. Despite everyone's efforts, not a trace of the little girl could be found. The police, however, were slow to react. In those early days, they dismissed the situation as a likely runaway case. Annarella came from a family weighed down by poverty and instability, and officers assumed she might have left in search of work, or simply to escape the hardship at home. Their assumptions, shaped by judgment rather than evidence, delayed the investigation at a critical moment. But Primavalle knew better. Days passed with no sightings, no clues, and no explanation. Fear tightened its grip on the neighborhood. Parents kept their children indoors, and whispers of what might have happened filled every doorstep. It wasn't until February 23rd, 5 full days after Annarella vanished, that the authorities finally acted. Her father, Annarella Bracci, arrived at the police station in tears, pleading for help. His desperation made clear what the community had already feared. This was no runaway. This was something far more serious. Only then did officers launch an official search. By that point, the entire district was on edge. Rome's newspapers caught hold of the story, turning it into headlines that painted a picture of a city struggling with rising crime and an overwhelmed police force. Public pressure mounted rapidly. Under scrutiny from both the press and the citizens of Rome, the police commissioner announced that finding 12-year-old Annarella was now a top priority. Search teams expanded their efforts into the surrounding neighborhoods, combing through areas like Trionfale and Monte Mario. But nothing emerged. With each passing hour, speculation grew. Had she run away to another town, or had someone taken her and hidden the truth far from sight? The case soon became the talk of Rome. In a desperate attempt to bring answers, a local baron offered a reward of 300,000 lire for any information that could help uncover what happened. But despite the growing urgency, the city remained without answers, while somewhere, a terrible secret was waiting to be found. As the days passed with no sign of Annarella, the police shifted their attention to the people closest to her. Their first focus was the Bracci family itself. Marta Foci, already overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion, was brought in and questioned for hours. She had no clear alibi for the night her daughter vanished, and her anxious, inconsistent answers only fueled suspicion. Investigators wondered if resentment had grown between mother and daughter, especially after Annarella's earlier court testimony regarding Marta's alleged adultery, a moment that had publicly embarrassed her. Officers interviewed neighbors and acquaintances, trying to piece together Marta's movements, but nothing they learned pointed to her involvement. The investigation stalled until they turned their attention to someone outside the family. Their next suspect was Leonello Aidi, a young gardener known in Primavalle by the nickname Il Biondino, the blonde boy. Aidi had lived in the Bracci family's basement sometime earlier and had been among the last people to see Annarella alive. He had spoken with her on Carnival night and bought her chestnuts just before she disappeared. That small interaction, though innocent on the surface, placed him squarely in the police's spotlight. Aidi was detained and interrogated, But beyond that brief encounter, investigators had nothing concrete tying him to the girl's disappearance. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no confession. Still, the court of public opinion reached its verdict long before the police did. Rumors spread quickly through Primavalle's crowded courtyards, and many residents became convinced that Aidi was responsible. In a community terrified and desperate for answers, suspicion became certainty, long before anyone knew the truth. On the evening of March 3, 1950, the search for Annarella came to a heartbreaking end. Her body was found at the bottom of an abandoned well on the outskirts of Primavalle. The discovery was made by her grandfather, Leonello Bracci, a man who had refused to give up hope. Every day since her disappearance, he had wandered the countryside, calling her name, searching fields and empty lots for any sign of her. Later, Leonello told police that he had been guided there by a dream, one in which he heard Annarella calling out to him. Whether it was intuition, desperation, or something deeper, he followed that feeling until it led him to the well. When he looked inside, he saw the unthinkable. Within hours, the once quiet stretch of land transformed into a gathering point for an entire community. Residents of Primavalle, already shaken by fear and uncertainty, now stood together in shock and grief. Many wept openly. Others simply stared, unable to process the cruelty of what had happened to the little girl they all knew. Police quickly cordoned off the area and began a full investigation. Officers searched the ground around the well, looking for footprints, discarded items, anything that might reveal who had brought Annarella there, or why. The grim discovery intensified public outrage. Newspapers rushed to the scene, capturing the anguish of a neighborhood that felt abandoned by the institutions meant to protect them. For the people of Primavalle, this was no longer just a missing child case. It was a tragedy demanding justice. And now that Annarella had been found, the pressure on authorities was greater than ever. The autopsy offered a painful window into Annarella's final moments. Medical examiners documented several injuries on her body, including 4 puncture wounds and multiple cuts to the back of her head, evidence that she had been attacked before she was placed in the well. Marks on her right hand suggested that she had tried to defend herself, fighting back in the only way a 12-year-old could. But one detail stood out above all others. There was water in her lungs. That finding confirmed the most heartbreaking truth. The child was still alive when she was thrown into the well, and she drowned there. The condition of her body made the investigation even more challenging. Because several days had passed before she was found, decomposition limited what forensic experts could determine. Some questions, especially those involving possible abuse, remained unanswered, locked behind the physical damage time had caused. This lack of clarity left investigators without critical information, and the community without the full truth. News of Annarella's murder spread across Rome with astonishing speed. Almost overnight, the disappearance of a young girl had become a national outrage. The public demanded answers, and the police, already criticized for their slow response, now faced intense pressure to deliver results. With journalists crowding outside police headquarters and emotions running high in Primavalle, investigators vowed to pursue every lead. That same evening, officers arrested Leonello Aidi, the young gardener who had been among the last to see Annarella alive. He was no stranger to the family, and his earlier interaction with the girl on Carnival night placed him directly in the spotlight. From that moment on, Aidi found himself at the center of the investigation. Another name briefly surfaced as a person of interest. Adamo Moroni, a man romantically involved with Marta Foci. But Moroni's wife provided a firm alibi, insisting he had been home all evening on February 18th. With no evidence tying him to Annarella's disappearance, the police shifted their focus back to Aidi. 5 days after the discovery of her body, Rome gathered to say goodbye to Annarella. The municipality paid for the funeral, as the Bracci family had no means to do so. Her small coffin was carried through the streets in a white horse-drawn carriage, followed by a crowd estimated at over 100,000 people, a sea of mourners, officials, clergy, and ordinary citizens. The procession was solemn, heavy with grief and anger. Many saw Annarella not only as a victim of a violent crime, but as a symbol of the hardships faced by poor families on the city's outskirts, families who often felt unseen and unprotected. Newspapers covered every moment of the funeral. Headlines described the tragedy as a failure of the state, a sign of the widening divide between Rome's wealthier districts and its struggling outskirts. One person was absent from the ceremony: Marta Foschi, Annarella's mother. She remained in police custody, still under suspicion. Investigators questioned her harshly, fueled in part by accusations from her son Mariano, who claimed Marta had mistreated his sister. Her nervous demeanor and contradictions during interrogation only deepened police distrust. Yet Marta did provide one detail that investigators found important. She told officers that Leonello Aidi had shown an unusual interest in her daughter, giving her small gifts and speaking to her frequently, behavior Marta said had always made her uncomfortable. After Aidi's arrest, rumors began circulating through Primavalle. He had been seen talking to young girls, offering them trinkets, and, people whispered, he had a troubling reputation even within his own family. Under mounting pressure, investigators intensified their questioning. And on March 10th, after days of interrogation, Aidi broke. He confessed to killing Annarella. According to his statement, he encountered her twice that evening, first near the chestnut vendor, and later as she returned from her errands. He claimed he invited her for a walk, leading her into a nearby field. When she resisted his advances and began to scream, he struck her with a stick fitted with a nail. She collapsed unconscious. Panicking, he dragged her to the abandoned well and threw her inside. He then simply went home, only to be approached later that night by Marta, who asked him to help search for her missing daughter. It was a confession that shocked the city. But as the investigation continued, the question would soon arise: was this a true confession, or one extracted under pressure? After giving his confession, Leonello Aidi was transferred to prison to await trial. What followed would become one of the most debated legal battles in post-war Rome. The trial opened on November 30th, 1951, and to the surprise of many, Aidi entered a plea of not guilty. In court, he recanted the confession he had signed months earlier, insisting it had not been freely given. He claimed that investigators had coerced him, that the statement had been extracted under physical and psychological pressure during long, relentless interrogations. Over the next several months, the courtroom heard conflicting testimony, shifting theories, and emotional appeals from both sides. But when the proceedings finally came to an end in February 1952, the jury ruled that the evidence was too weak to convict him. Aidi was acquitted of Annarella's murder. The verdict split the community. Some residents believed justice had been served, that the police, desperate to save face, had unfairly targeted a young man from a poor district. Others were convinced the courts had let a guilty man walk free. In Primavalle, that debate would linger for years. Not long after his acquittal, Aidi was arrested again, this time for attempting to assault another young girl during a local festival. That case resulted in a 3-year prison sentence, adding even more controversy to his earlier acquittal. As public anger resurfaced, prosecutors appealed the original not guilty verdict in Annarella's case. In a stunning reversal, the appeals court overturned the acquittal and declared Aidi guilty of the murder, sentencing him to 26 years in prison. Aidi's wife, Vlai, publicly denounced the ruling. She insisted that her husband was innocent, arguing that the courts had bowed to pressure from the media and the public rather than the evidence. But the legal battle was far from over. The case of Annarella, already tragic, was becoming even more tangled, raising new questions about justice, truth, and the limits of the system designed to protect them. In 1961, the legal battle surrounding Leonello Aidi took yet another turn. Italy's High Court reviewed the case and ultimately overturned the previous conviction. With that ruling, Aidi was released once again, adding yet another layer of uncertainty to a case that had already shaken Rome for more than a decade. After his release, Aidi and his family left Primavalle and relocated to Vibo Valentia, a town in southern Italy, where they hoped to escape the scrutiny that had followed them for years. But even there, trouble found him. Not long after the move, he was arrested again, this time for inappropriate behavior involving young girls. That charge resulted in a 6-year prison sentence, reinforcing the cloud of suspicion that had surrounded him since Annarella's disappearance. As the years passed, public memory began to fade. The headlines that once dominated Rome's newspapers slowly disappeared. New tragedies emerged, new political struggles took center stage, and the outrage that had once united an entire community gradually quieted. For many, the story of Annarella Bracci slipped into the background of Italy's post-war history, an unsolved, unsettling reminder of a little girl whose life had been taken far too soon. Her death, though deeply mourned in its time, eventually became one of the many forgotten tragedies buried within the nation's past. But for those who lived through it, the pain never fully faded. And for Primavalle, Annarella's name would always be tied to a moment when fear, injustice, and unanswered questions left a permanent mark on the community. For Marta Focci, life after Annarella's death was marked by an unending series of hardships. Even before losing her daughter, tragedy had already settled heavily on the family. In 1951, her son Mariano passed away, and only months later she lost her daughter Teresina as well. The grief compounded quickly, and the weight of those losses never lifted. Out of Marta's 6 children, only 2 would live longer than she did. Every year seemed to bring another blow, another reminder of a life defined by struggle, poverty, and heartbreak. While the world gradually forgot the story of little Annarella, Marta carried the pain with her until the end of her days. For her, the tragedy was never just a headline, it was the story of a family slowly shattered by loss. In the end, justice for Annarella never arrived in a clear or comforting form. Trials were overturned, confessions were denied, suspects walked free, only to return to prison for other crimes. And through it all, the truth slipped further into the cracks of time. For her family, the suffering never stopped. One child lost, then another and another, until grief became the only familiar companion in a home already weighed down by poverty and pain. Decades passed. The headlines faded, and the world moved on. But somewhere in the narrow streets of Primavalle, the memory of a little girl, a girl who went out to buy pasta, oil, and coal, still lingers like a shadow at dusk. Annarella's story is more than a crime. It is a reminder of the children who grow up unseen, of the families left behind, and of the truth swallowed by fear, desperation, and silence. And even if the world forgets her name, the injustice done to her must never be forgotten. Annarella may be gone, but her memory should never fade. Stories like Annarella's survive only when someone chooses to remember them. If you want to hear more untold histories and forgotten tragedies, I invite you to stay with us here on Buried Inquists. Thank you for watching and for keeping her memory alive.